We can do it. Yes, we can. We can change things throughout the land, but we all must lend a hand. We can do it. Oh, yes, we can. Oh, your neighbor over there, a bit bewildered, but he cares. He just doesn't know what to do. Join together and then they'll be two.
Hi, I'm Linda Weltner, your host, and today we have a woman who's a friend of mine, Lynn Nadeau, and she has just returned from a trip to Israel. So we're going to get the latest scoop on what is happening there now. My first question, Lynn, is, do you remember the first time you ever heard of Israel?
I do. I grew up Jewish, and we always sent money for trees to make the desert bloom.
Right, I remember there were these things, I don't know whether we put leaves on them or trees or something, but it was when you were in Sunday school, you were growing trees for Israel.
Yes, and it was amazing, not to get to the end of the story, to see how fertile and beautiful it is in Israel. It was really, the desert truly does bloom there. It was really wonderful. And then when my mother got older, she said she wanted to be buried in Israel. So as an American Jew, I always had some sort of a relationship with Israel, and kind of in the back of my mind thought I would go someday. But it took a very long time to get there.
Like a lifetime, right?
Like a lifetime, because every time I went on a different trip, I would think, when am I going to Israel? I wonder. But I didn't want to go. I was afraid to be faced with prejudices, with war, with lack of security, with hatred, with all that I thought about when I thought about
life on
Israel,
the ground. Yeah.
When I thought about life in Israel. So it was hard for me to decide to go.
And you did go. Why?
Well, it was a funny little catalyst. I guess I should say that I went with a group called J Street. And J Street had a meeting in Marblehead, and run by the Democrats, the Marblehead Democratic Town Committee. I went to that meeting, and I brought my 10-year-old grandson, and I tried to tell him what was going on in Israel and what the situation was, which I didn't know very well. But we went into the meeting and started to listen to people talk when about 8 Russian Jews came into the room and started screaming at the people on the panel.
I was actually at that meeting, now that I recall.
Were you? It
Right.
was disgusting.
It was really ad hominem. They told him he was like the secret police.
They said awful things.
Yeah.
And I said to Max, we're not staying. I don't think you should experience this animosity.
Right.
So we left. But then I thought, I wonder who those people were, J Street, that made these other people so angry. And I thought I'd try to learn who they were and find out something about them. And I did. And I went and I had some meetings with some people in J Street, and I found them to be reasonable, thoughtful people who are pro-Israeli, pro-peace, working for a two-state solution, working for Palestine and in Israel, existing side by side. And I decided they were the people I wanted to go to Israel with.
So they're Jews, they're pro-Israel, but they want a two-state solution. That's what they think is the solution to the conflict.
Yes, and they're Americans.
They're Americans.
They are working on, they do have a lobby in Washington to lobby the American government to support a state for the Israelis and a state for the Palestinians.
And there is a group of pro-Israel American Jews who think that's the worst solution, right?
Well, the other group, the large lobby group, says that they support whatever the government of Israel wants. J Street does not support whatever the government of Israel wants. They are supporting a long-term solution for security and two states.
When did you go?
I went May 1st through 14th, 2013.
And where did you go? Did you see all the tourist sites?
No, I saw hardly any of the tourist sites. In fact, when people ask me, what I saw, they're surprised because we did go into the West Bank. Let me just say something about the West Bank. There's something called a Green Line, which divides the area west of the Jordan River and created the state of Israel in 1947 when it was created. That Green Line set aside an area that was to be a Palestine, and that is now called by various people the West Bank, the occupied territory, occupied Palestine. It depends on what you want to call it. I think we could call it any of those descriptions. You could call it a disputed area, but it should be what would be the state of Palestine when John Kerry and the president have worked with the Palestine Authority and with the Israeli government to get two states.
And so part of that second state would be part of the West Bank.
The second state would be the area referred to as the West Bank.
Only the West Bank?
And Gaza. There's a little area,
right,
there's
yeah.
a small area on the sea called Gaza, which would be part of Palestine also. So where else did I go? Oh, to the West Bank. Tel Aviv, our base was Tel Aviv for 4 nights and Jerusalem for 6 nights. And I went to the Dead Sea and a couple of other places that are more touristical places. But my view was to understand and to listen to the people who were in that area and what they thought and what they were doing and what their goals were.
Well, now, I know the answer to this question, and I'm very impressed. So why don't you drop a few names and tell us whom you met with?
I couldn't believe who we met with. In one day, for example, we met with the President of Israel, Shimon Peres, and the Prime Minister of the Palestine Authority, Salam Fayyad. He had resigned, but he was still acting in that role. We met with 15 different members of the Knesset. We met with Palestinian business people who want, and entrepreneurs. We met with people from settlements. We met with Bedouins in a Bedouin community. We met with human rights organizations, people in human rights organizations. We met with the daughter of Rabin, who showed us through the museum built in his honor for peace.
She had lunch with you. It's
And
not.
had lunch with,
yeah.
Yes, we met with all these people in a small group. It was a group of 18.
And you met with a woman whose son had been killed in the war, an Israeli woman.
Yes, that was one of the human rights organizations called Parent Circle. When her son was killed by a Palestinian terrorist, she said, "And no one shall kill in my son's name." And she formed a group of Palestinian parents and Israeli parents to work together in honor of the deaths of their children to work for peace. And we met with a person who was a young man who had organized the kind of Occupy movement of 2 summers ago, the summer of 2011, which was protesting the price of cottage cheese and living. And he talked to us about his work and tying peace and the amount of money spent on the military as compared to human resources. And we met with people who were working with Bedouin teenagers and Israeli teenagers in schools to teach in each other's schools and help each other. And we met with very important people, and we met with
grassroots
people.
It's interesting, this whole thing. I saw it was like a yardstick, and in the U.S. the military budget is this much. And then you've got the State Department, which is this much, and then you've got Homeland Security, which is this much, and for the good of the country, you would be astounded how little money is spent on the quality of life, and that's true in Israel.
Right.
When you get into a perpetual war situation,
Right.
the real purpose of a government, I would think, is to give its people a meaningful life with jobs and good air and whatever, and instead these countries are so war-oriented, especially
Well, they have
in
to
the
spend
budget.
money on that. As President Shimon Peres said to us, for you have Canada to the north, Mexico to the south, and fish on both sides. Look at our neighbors. So you can understand that the most telling problem in Israel that matters to everyone is security. When the Second Intifada was begun in 2000. It was horrible. It was terrible to be afraid that you were going to sit in a nightclub and
Or a restaurant.
And have a terrorist kill the people there. I sat in a restaurant in Tel Aviv, a delicious Italian restaurant, and when we were finishing our meal, someone said, you know, a few years ago this place was bombed and destroyed. And the idea of that, you can understand why there's a need for security.
Now, you met an Arab, you were telling me before, an Arab who said that he felt that the Second Intifada was a mistake. Who was that?
That was one of that was more than one. It was more than one person that said that. We met with the mayor of a little village about the size of Marblehead.
An Arab village.
An Arab village in the West Bank, and we met with the mayor and his council. In fact, we had lunch with the mayor and his council on his roof of his home. There's a lot of eating on the roof that
Let
goes
me just
on.
say this. A lot of people do not think this kind of a trip is fun, but both of us, this sounds like heaven to me. I've gone on trips with Witness for Peace and Global Exchange. I love meeting the movers and shakers instead of seeing the museums or the buildings.
Know.
So you're on
I
the
can
roof.
never go anywhere else again now that I know what it's like to eat on the roof of the mayor's house in a small village in the West Bank and talk about his desire for peace and for a Palestine that will serve the people that live there.
So you met Palestinians who were willing to admit that the Second Intifada was a terrible mistake, and who have other ideas other than war, or what people say, driving Israel into the sea, who have a different vision of a future where people could live together.
Absolutely. They inspired partially by the success of Israel in creating a country that is burgeoning. Tel Aviv has IT, it has a lot of businesses, medical, IT, everything. And the Palestinian, who some call the Jews of the Arab world, also want to be entrepreneurs and have a country that works for them. That is their desire. That's what we heard everywhere that we went in the West Bank. Granted, we didn't talk to anybody that was a terrorist. They didn't arrange for a meeting with a terrorist. I don't know, what that would be. But what I can tell you is that we went, for example, let me tell you about Rawabi. It is a planned community being built right now in the West Bank for 20 to 30,000 people who will live together in a village with teachers, with grocers, with people living together in a village, in a community, built with Qatari funds, with some UN funds, built in the hopes and in the dream that they will be living in their own country called Palestine.
These are Arabs, 20, 30,000 Arabs?
Yes. And we saw people wanting to buy one of the unbuilt condos in this village. I call it village, but it was high-rises with apartments on the floors. And you could see what the inside would look like. You could pick out your fixtures, and here were people. And before I went, I have to admit, the Palestinian flag had kind of frightened me. And the idea of I was a little bit afraid of Palestinians in that I thought they were terrorists. But when I grew up, I was a little afraid of Christians. I didn't like the cross. I was afraid of them too. So for me, in each case, I've gotten to see the human face of the other. And in this case, the human face of those Palestinians was a very familiar face for me.
So what you're saying is that these people want to build a village and not focus on the war with Israel, but focus on building a life that is satisfying and profitable and social and all that kind of
and
stuff.
Normal, not occupied by another nation, and have their own country and their own flag and their own language and their own money. And then they want to be able to trade with their neighbors and live a life like that. Now, some people in the U.S. think a theocracy is the kind of country we can't support. So what I like to think of is Israel is a country for the ethnic people called Jews. Palestine is a country for the ethnic people called Palestinians. And yes, there are different people that will live in those places. But one of the things that I did when I was there that was very exciting was fought the theocracy of Israel, which is that the rabbis, the most orthodox religious rabbis, get to determine many of the rules of the country. There is a place called the Wailing Wall, the Kotel, where Jews from all over the world go and stick little messages in it, pray, and find it to be a very important place. For 25 years, Anat Hoffman and a group called the Women of the Wall have gone once a month on a special day called Rosh Chodesh, which is the new moon celebration. Yeah. And they go there to celebrate the new moon and do a prayer service in their own way, not the way the rabbis want them to.
Now, what I hear is that the rabbis have set aside a place for women, but they say you can't wear talis. You can't bring the Torah.
You can't bring carry the Torah if you're a woman. You can't raise your voice in prayer because women's voices should be not heard. And those are the 4 elements that the women want to be able to do.
Like men, yeah.
Like men.
Yeah.
So of all the amazing fortuitous events, I was there in Jerusalem on Rosh Chodesh. It was a Friday morning, and the J Street contingent was told, if you want to go to the wall with the Women of the Wall, this is going to be a special time, because women had been arrested for breaking the rabbi's rules beforehand, and a Supreme Court decision in Israel had decided that they were not breaking the law by acting against the common way that things were done.
Right.
So the women were going to be there in force.
For the first time. Without the police dragging them off. Yeah.
And so the rabbis had put out a call for the seminary girls and the
Orthodox had put out the call
to show up in great numbers to prevent the women from getting to the wall and praying. So, in fact, I had been on that plaza before when I first arrived, and there weren't that many people there. Well, when we got there, it was mobbed. It was a mob scene because so many of these ultra-Orthodox youngsters were there to protest the Women of the Wall from acting in the way they did. And for the first time in Israeli history, the women were protected by the police rather than arrested by the police. So it was a very exciting historic moment to be there, and I felt that it was helping for Israel to become more of a a state that allowed for different ways of being rather than...
Because, both states have been defined by the extremists.
Yes.
We've got the jihadis on one side, and we've got the Orthodox on the other side, and the focus has got to be on what the middle-of-the-road people want out of life.
Yes, and we reasonable people, let's just say, who are looking at things from different sides and want a future that works for everybody, we have to be louder and speak out for what we believe in.
Let me ask you, what is the two-state solution?
Oh, just that there's a Palestine and an Israel.
Independent
countries, states, meaning
all right.
countries.
And I know there are people who feel that J Street is a traitorous organization. I don't understand. Why is that a bad idea? Why do people say it's not a good idea?
Because of the extremism. Some extremist Jews would say Israel should be all the land from the west of the Jordan River, from the border of what is now Jordan. And some Arab Muslims perhaps will say there shouldn't be any Israel, there should only be Palestine. So that's those extremists that you're speaking about. But the position of people who can see things from more perspective than one would say there needs to be two states for two peoples.
Now, this is the argument I've heard, that if we stay with one state and the Palestinians continue to reproduce at a higher rate than the Israelis, then you're going to be in a position eventually where there are more Arabs in Israel than there are Israelis. And then you won't be able to have a democracy anymore because it wouldn't be a Jewish state. So you would have to have some form of non-democratic rule to keep the Palestinians out of power.
Right. So this is what they call the demographic argument, and one wonders which demography is increasing faster. Of course, the ultra-conservative Jewish families are producing children in large numbers now, maybe to make up for the Holocaust, who knows. And the Arab Palestinians are a little less interested in having quite so many children because they want to live a bourgeois middle-class life, have jobs, and live their lives. But it's not just the demographic issue that is a problem for Israelis. Israel was founded on what I call Jewish values of justice, fairness, and a lot of them were socialists, actually. They founded communes and kibbutzes so that people could live side by side with the Arab population. Yeah. And there were terrible things done on both sides, but we have to be where we are now.
Right.
And look at what is now.
Which is that there are a bunch of Arabs that you can't get rid of, and a bunch of Israelis you can't get rid of. So that's the facts.
Right. And so the facts as they are now, to me, and to J Street, not that I could speak for them, cry out for the creation of a state called Palestine, which will allow the state of Israel to not have to spend so much money making separate roads, settlements, and checkpoints, and making life really hard for the ordinary people that live there.
Now, what about the argument that the settlements have made Palestine impossible because we have all these Israeli villages?
Those settlements really dot the West Bank in a way that's that makes it very difficult for people to travel from one village to another. And some of them will have to be taken down, destroyed. The people will have to be relocated into Israel. There's just no question about that.
Don't destroy them. Let the Arabs live in them.
If that's what will happen, that would be great. Yes,
that would be better. I hate when things get destroyed that are
built.
built.
That's not exactly what happened in Gaza, but we don't need to go into that.
But, I understand. You were saying that there are roads that Israelis can't go on because they lead to Arab villages, and they're kind of rutted and not so good, but that there are beautiful highways that the Arabs
high-speed highways to get to the settlements for only the Israelis who live in the settlements to get there.
So does it have signs like no Israelis allowed?
It's like an Alice in Wonderland world if you don't know the rules, which is hard to figure out what the rules are, because the rules are often capricious and in a little
So like you could, as an internationalist, that you can go anywhere.
But the Israeli Jews nobody goes to the West Bank. None of the Israeli Jews know what is being done in their name in the West Bank. They're living, they say, in Tel Aviv, for example, in the bubble, where life is good. It's like life here. We live in the bubble. We don't notice about the pollution and the inner city and all that. We just live our lives. And yes, that's true there as well.
Well then, we could do a part 2. I know there's so much more. There's Hebron.
Yes.
But first, I want you to end and tell me about your daughter-in-law.
Oh, I went with my daughter-in-law, Carrie Lorigan, who's Irish and Catholic. Well, she's lapsed, really. And when I said I was going to Israel, she's a middle school teacher in Watertown. She has students in her class that are Israeli Jews, New Americans, Palestinian Arabs, and she wanted to see, and they get along. They love each other. They're in the same classes. And she wanted to know something about the background of her students. So she came along with me. And I would say it was really a mitzvah, a pleasure to be with my daughter-in-law and to get along so beautifully, to be in agreement about everything, not that we had disagreed much before, and to experience this with her.
May I wish all of you a daughter-in-law who agrees with you. That is the highest compliment one can pay to a daughter-in-law. And I gather Carrie had pretty much the same reflections on
Absolutely.
what was great about the trip and what was disturbing about the trip. Well, let's hope we hear more about this. Thanks for listening. I'm Linda Weltner. Saying
Lynn
goodbye
Nadeau.
to Lynn Nadeau.
Cause the problems can all be solved with dedication and a little resolve. Obstacles slowly dissolve when we all just get involved. We can do it. Yes, we can. We can change things throughout the land. But we all lend a hand. We can do it. Oh, yes, we can. We can do it.